Hello everybody and welcome to today's 10-minute briefing around the Worker Protection Act. My name is Carly and I'm the consultant who's going to be working through this briefing with you today, this one specifically for staff working within the youth sector. So let's consider the legal duty, the new piece of legislation, the Worker Protection Act. Now, this piece of legislation is largely focused around the creation of safe workspaces for all who are employed or volunteer within them, particularly safeguarding them from acts of sexual harassment or misconduct. And when we think about legislation outlined to safeguard employees in this space, this isn't the only legislation where it exists. It's actually also highlighted much earlier in our Equalities Act of 2010. But the Equalities Act, very much having more of a neutral statement around what sexual harassment is and that it shouldn't go on. It didn't really place a specific duty on the role of an employer in taking reasonable steps to prevent all employees from experiencing this form of harm throughout the course of their time within the workplace itself. The Worker Protection Act's key focus is to plug that gap. On the back of this law, it now uses the terms reasonable steps that all employers have to take to make sure all of its staff are prevented from experiencing forms of sexual harassment or misconduct throughout the course of their employment with them. So very much a more active, clearly defined role, part to play that employers themselves should now have to safeguard its workforce and team members. And if an employment tribunal feels that perhaps an employer has now breached this legal preventative duty, the employer itself could be instructed to pay up to 25% uplift of compensatory award to the employee, having huge implications therefore upon the organisation, but also quite rightly highlighting that all of our workspaces should feel safe and comfortable, and therefore this type of behaviour should not be allowed to take place. So let's consider then, what types of behaviour quantify as forms of sexual harassment or misconduct? And the Equalities and Human Rights Commission helps provide a piece of guidance for us to give really clear and tangible examples of what constitutes as these forms of behaviour. Examples as what you can see here listed on our current screen. Whether that's perhaps things such as physical behaviours making people uncomfortable, maybe the sharing of content, perhaps what we say, the manner in what we disclose, over intimate in its information, again leading to that element of distress or discomfort for those who witness or are involved with that. And it's these types of things that we need to make sure if we spot, that we report, to ensure that the employer is adhering to their legal duty of prevention of this type of harm. Because nobody should be left to feel uncomfortable aligned to these types of behaviours within the workplace itself. So starting with then the focus for the employer. Perhaps you today are listening, leading a team, chief exec, manager of a youth setting, and you're thinking, where do I start? Well, the first thing we always suggest we consider doing is an audit, a needs analysis, really helping to plot and work out what is your organisation's starting point, and audit possible weak spots that we need to build on and strengthen in order to make sure we are compliant with this new legal duty. So it aligns to things such as knowing your workforce and your employee demographic. Your duty, of course, not only to employed staff, but volunteers who naturally may support you within the sector. Perhaps they run workshops, they're a session lead, perhaps they support in the wider activities your youth organisation provides. But we also need to consider the environments, the spaces which could possibly mean this type of risk is more or possibly more likely to take place. So it's doing an environmental health check as well. And of course, within the youth sector, that may mean in lots of different spaces, whether we are out on using leisure centres, perhaps activities, sporting events, Maybe we are partnering with different organisations, providing sessions within their workspaces too. Or perhaps it's just out in the community, maybe even conducting home visits. All of those spaces in which your employees enter as part of the course of the work they're doing, we need to consider the risk associated with the space and what preventative steps the employer could take to mitigate any harm of this nature happening to them across the variety of spaces your youth provision may naturally enter. But equally, how confident and knowledgeable are our staff in recognising even what this risk is? Let's provide them with those tangible examples, update our staff code of conduct or our staff handbook so they're very clear on what is and certainly what is not okay in terms of these behaviours. And wider policies can help to highlight those too, particularly when it comes to what is the response the employer will take. What are your reasonable actions within the organisation itself? Who are the key people to report to? And what are the actions and outcomes of any possible investigations then that may take place also? So it's all of these things we need to highlight for us in our sector around those reasonable steps. Because what is reasonable naturally is going to vary from organisation to organisation, according to its nuances and differences. Things such as its size, the sector, the ways that we work, the spaces in which we engage, where our staff naturally administer their duties. And of course, our resources, our capacity, what are we able to provide according to the nature and size of the organisation itself. But for even very small youth sector organisations, clubs, activities, engagements, none of us are exempt. Every employer, regardless of sector, now has this legal duty to comply to the Worker Protection Act. So it really comes back to those senior leads, those managers, those chief execs, doing that audit, that needs check analysis, knowing the organisation workforce and spaces, and then building reasonable steps on the back of that. And the reasonable steps themselves should not merely be that tick box activity. Ultimately, the agenda of this legislation is to make sure the workspace is safe for everyone. So aspects that may naturally then need to be considered to support that process are things such as the wider reflection on your organisation's culture. How are we proactively reviewing and updating procedures? How are we supporting our staff and workforce and volunteers with their understanding and engagement of what this is and how we respond? Are we being proactive in thinking about risk assessments, those preventative measures? And of course, being very clear on what the reporting and supporting process will be, particularly if it leans itself into following into a formal investigation. What are the timescales? What's the process? What are the possible outcomes? By providing clarity to all of our workforce, paid and unpaid, we can really aim towards creating that safe and effective culture. Now, if today is perhaps your first time of engaging with this piece of legislation, what it means, really painting the landscape of where your next steps are, we're here very much to support you with that. We have lots of great wider free resources. We've got a podcast from a HR professional engaging with this landscape. And we also offer bespoke training, consultancy, and auditing too. So please do reach out to us on any of our social media platforms or drop in an email at the email address info@ecpsafeguarding.co.uk. Thank you so much for stepping by, and we hope to engage you again in the near future. Take care, everyone.